In 1914, when World War I began, governments did not gather their people and say, "We have enough money for this war," because they didn't. What they said instead was, "This war will be short, this war will pay for itself, and this war is necessary." But guess what? All three were wrong. The first statement, that the war would be short, was perhaps the most catastrophic miscalculation in modern history. Military planners believed that modern industrial societies couldn't sustain prolonged conflict. They imagined a war like those of the previous century: decisive battles, clear victories, gentlemen agreements. But they were completely wrong. World War I lasted for 4 years, 3 months, and 7 days. It consumed an entire generation, and it created a financial model that would reshape how nations fight wars forever. At the start of World War I, governments believed the war would last for few months, perhaps until Christmas 1914. They planned to pay using three traditional methods: existing savings, higher taxes, and short-term borrowings, expecting quick repayment after victory. This approach had worked for smaller conflicts throughout the 19th century, but industrial war exploded costs beyond imagination. The Battle of the Somme alone used more ammunition in 1 week than was fired during the entire Napoleonic Wars. A single artillery shell cost what a working-class family earned in a month. These shells were being fired by thousands, every hour, every day, for months. The British Army in 1914 consisted of about 247,000 soldiers. By 1918, Britain had mobilized nearly 5 million men. Each one needed a uniform, boots, a rifle, ammunition, food, shelter, medical care, and transportation. Now multiply that across all major powers, and you will understand the financial impossibility of what was happening. Within months, every major power was broke. Gold reserves were depleting at terrifying rates. Tax revenues couldn't keep pace. Citizens were already sacrificing their sons and brothers, asking them to also surrender half their income, risked revolution. So governments faced a choice: stop the war or break the financial system. They chose option 2. Gold rules were quietly suspended. Central banks began printing money with nothing backing it except government promises. Governments issued massive war bonds, borrowing from citizens, banks, and foreign lenders. This was the first time entire nations fought using money from the future, money that didn't exist yet, to pay for debts that had already occurred. War bonds were marketed as patriotic duty. Posters showed soldiers bleeding in trenches with captions like, "Buy bonds or they die." Children received piggy banks shaped like tanks. Movie stars like Charlie Chaplin promoted them at massive rallies. Churches preached that buying bonds was a Christian duty. But here's what war bonds really were: they were IOUs from the government, promises to pay back borrowed money with interest at some point in the future. Instead of taxing people heavily during the war, which would cause immediate anger, governments borrowed from them instead. This was a psychological genius. When you are taxed, you lose money today. You feel poorer immediately. You might protest. But when you buy a bond, you feel like you are investing. You are told you'll get your money back plus extra. You are participating in victory. People felt proud. They felt involved. They didn't feel poorer. But debt doesn't disappear, it waits, and when it comes due, it brings friends. Friends like interest, inflation, and economic stagnation. Printing money doesn't feel painful immediately. That's why it's so politically tempting. When governments print money, there's no immediate confrontation, no protests. The money appears in government's accounts and keeps the war machine running smoothly. But as more money entered the system, something inevitable happened. Prices rose as more money chased the same goods. Savings lost value, wages fell behind. Inflation became a silent tax, perhaps the most insidious tax ever invented. People didn't receive a bill, but their money bought less bread, less milk, less coal. A pound or dollar that once fed a family for a week now lasted for only 3 days. For workers on fixed income, this was devastating. For retirees on pension, it was catastrophic. For anyone who had saved money expecting it to retain value, the war stole their future. World War I ended in 1918, but the economic damage had just begun. In Britain, prices had more than doubled. In France, they had tripled. In Italy, they had quadrupled. This represented a massive transfer of wealth from savers to the government. Germany lost the war militarily and was financially destroyed. It faced massive war debt, reparations of 132 billion gold marks, which was roughly 3 times its annual GDP, a weakened economy, and political chaos. Germany couldn't tax enough. The population was exhausted and angry. It couldn't borrow internationally because no one trusted Germany, so it printed money. At first, it seemed manageable, then it spiraled. By 1923, inflation turned into hyperinflation, one of the most extreme economic disasters ever recorded. In January 1923, a loaf of bread cost 250 marks. By September, 1.5 million marks. By November, 200 billion marks. Money became worthless overnight. People were paid in the morning and rushed to spend it by afternoon before prices doubled again. Wheelbarrows of cash were needed for groceries. Children played with stack of bills like building blocks. Savings built over decades vanished. A lifetime of careful saving became enough to buy postage stamp. Retirees were wiped out. Middle-class families collapsed into poverty overnight. This wasn't just an economic disaster. It destroyed trust in money, in government, and in democracy itself. That collapse created conditions where extremism could flourish. By World War II, governments understood something crucial. People will accept war more easily if they don't feel the cost immediately. So taxes were raised, but not enough to cover costs. In the United States, taxes covered only 45% of war costs. The rest was borrowed. War bonds were issued again, but with better marketing. Hollywood produced films showing bond buyers as heroes. Bonds were sold through payroll deduction, making it automatic. This time, central banks played a larger role. They bought government bonds directly, creating money to fund the war. They controlled interest rates, keeping them artificially low. They created money quietly. Inflation replaced direct taxation as the main tool of war finance. But unlike World War I, this inflation was managed and controlled. Unlike Europe, the United States wasn't destroyed. While European cities were bombed into rubble, American factories were stronger than ever. While other countries owed debt, America was owed money. At Bretton Woods in 1944, representatives from 44 countries redesigned the global financial system. The dollar was tied to gold at $35 per ounce. Other currencies were tied to the dollar. The IMF and World Bank were created. This made the US the center of global finance, but the system assumed the US would remain financially disciplined, that America wouldn't print more dollars than it had gold to back them. That assumption never holds forever. After World War II, something fundamentally new happened. Wars didn't end, they transformed into something permanent. The Cold War created standing armies of unprecedented size. Nuclear weapons requiring constant maintenance, hundreds of American military bases worldwide, endless defense research, and vast intelligence agencies. This wasn't temporary, it was permanent. Military spending became normal. Defense contractors became permanent fixtures. Entire regions became dependent on military spending. Debt became normal too. Governments stopped asking, can we afford this? Instead, they asked, can we borrow this? And the answer was always yes, because central banks would ensure it. This removed the last natural check on government spending. The Vietnam War exposed the limit of post-war financial order. The US was spending heavily on war while expanding welfare programs at home. President Johnson wanted both guns and butter. The problem was mathematical. America was printing more dollars than it had gold to back them, and foreign governments began demanding gold. France became particularly aggressive under Charles de Gaulle. America didn't have enough gold. It was leaving Fort Knox faster than it could be replenished. So in 1971, President Nixon made a historic decision. He ended the gold standard, what he called temporarily closing the gold window. Money was no longer tied to gold. From that moment, money was tied only to government debt and trust. This removed the last financial brake on war. Once money was delinked from gold, governments gained enormous freedom. They could print more, borrow more, spend more, without immediate consequences. Wars no longer needed to be paid for traditionally. They just needed political approval. This is why modern wars don't require national sacrifice. No widespread rationing, no mass war bond drives, no dramatic tax increases. They require debt, and debt is always available. This made war easier to start and harder to end. When wars required immediate sacrifice, citizens paid attention, they questioned, and they demanded quick victories. But when wars are financed invisibly through debt, public pressure remains minimal. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan cost trillions. Estimates range from $3 trillion to over $8 trillion, including long-term costs. But taxes weren't raised. In fact, taxes were cut. The Bush administration passed major tax cuts in 2001 and 2003, even while launching two major wars. The wars were funded almost entirely through borrowing, which was historically unprecedented. Politicians promised affordability. Defense Secretary Rumsfeld estimated Iraq would cost $50 to $60 billion in total. These estimates were off by orders of magnitude. Even today, interest is still being paid on debt issued to finance these wars. Veterans' costs continue for decades. Equipment must be replaced, and in many cases, the interest paid will eventually exceed the original war spending. Now, who really pays for war? Well, not politicians. They're out of office before bills come due. Not journals, not defense companies. They profit from contracts paid with borrowed money. The cost is paid through inflation, making your money buy less. Lower public spending elsewhere means roads, schools, and hospitals get less funding. Higher future taxes means your children pay more to service debt. Reduced purchasing power means real wages grow slower. Debt spreads pain across time and generations, making it politically invisible. A politician can start a war today and leave office before the bills arrive. The cost is borne by future generations who had no vote in the decision. Older wars ended because money ran out. Napoleon's army retreated from Russia partly because he couldn't finance continued occupation. Throughout history, wars ended when treasuries emptied. Modern wars don't end because money doesn't run out. They fade, they shift, they are renamed. Combat operations become adversaries' mission. Troops draw down but never fully withdraw. Financially, continuing is easier than stopping. Debt removes urgency. There is no crisis when treasury empties because it never does. Central banks ensure money is always available. Ending a war requires political will. Continuing requires only inertia and debt, which are both abundant. If governments had to collect the full cost of war through immediate taxation, most wars would never happen. If citizens paid upfront, seeing exactly what wars cost, they would require clear objectives, exit strategies, and cost-benefit analysis. Debt doesn't just fund war, it makes war easy, politically, economically, and psychologically. Wars become abstract policy decisions rather than immediate national sacrifices. They become sustainable indefinitely rather than urgent problems demanding resolution. As long as borrowing remains unlimited, as long as central banks stand ready to create money, as long as future cost remains invisible, war will always remain an option, even when peace would be cheaper and wiser. The question we must ask is, should money be this easy? Should wars require so little sacrifice from those who choose it? Should future generations inherit bills for conflict they never supported? These aren't just economic questions, they are moral questions about how societies should function, about who bears the cost of decisions, about what limits should exist on government power. The debt war machine has been running for over a century. It had made conflicts possible that would have been unthinkable in earlier eras. Perhaps it's time to ask whether we have removed too many constraints, and what it might cost us if we don't put some back. If you found this insightful, then don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.